Today, it is my honor to introduce the poet Sadia Bashir, author of the 2018 collection Seven, the number seven in Islam, referring to God as the all-powerful creator. In Seven, Sadia explores her life journey as a young Muslim woman, confronting battles with internal and external sexism and racism, and exploring radical self-love and healing. They are poems about both trauma and triumph. Sadia is a multifaceted artist, born of a family of writers. She began writing poetry as a means of self-expression, becoming a two-time youth Grand Slam poetry champion. Sadia has performed for international organizations such as Al Jazeera and UNICEF, and has been commissioned to write poems by Apple and Penny Appeal USA. She is currently working on a second manuscript documenting the history and lives of Black Muslims in America. Sadia will be joined in conversation by Rashida James-Saadiya, a visual artist, writer, and cultural educator invested in transforming social perceptions through creative literature. Her work explores migration, identity, and the transmission of spirituality through poetry and song among Muslim women in West Africa and the American South. After iftar tonight at 8:30 p.m., Sadia will give a performance of her poetry. She's a moving and dynamic performer, so I urge everyone to please come out to hear her tonight. All are welcome. These events were made possible by a Building Bridges grant from the Doris Duke Foundation in conjunction with Duke Performances and the Duke Islamic Studies Center. Our project seeks to give an additional platform to the work of Muslim American poets, musicians, and filmmakers of African descent. Our aim is to deeply engage in a process of reckoning, consciousness raising, and reconciliation through the arts. In doing so, we hope to raise awareness about ongoing issues of anti-Black racism and anti-Muslim bias in the North Atlantic world. But we also strive to engage in a process of historical contextualization of the rich tradition of Islamic art, and specifically the vibrant tradition of Black Muslim art in the United States. I would like to thank the Doris Duke Foundation, Duke Performances, and the Center for Muslim Life. And I would like to extend a special thanks to Julie Maxwell, Brian Valentine, and Emma Harver, along with all those who have worked to help make this happen, specifically Sadia and Rashida. Ramadan Mubarak to everybody.
So let's get into it, Sadia. I'm really excited about what's going to come up and what we'll explore in today's conversation. So first and foremost, Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak to you.
Walaikum salam.
So how are you?
I'm good. I'm excited.
I'm excited as well. So I have a lot of questions, but before we sort of go down that path, I want to center this conversation with a quote from poet, writer, and activist Amir Baraka. And that quote is, "The artist's role is to raise the consciousness of the people, to make them understand life, the world, and themselves more completely. That's how I see it. Otherwise, I don't know why you would do it." So before we get into like why you do this, one of the reasons that I'm sharing this quote is because I think that poets are carriers of history, cultural memory, resilience, and hope. Yet we often are so consumed with the art of like dissecting the meaning of a poem that we overlook or lack opportunities to consider the person behind the work, right? The person behind the poem. Excuse me. And so I'm wondering if we can sort of go back to the beginning. I want to explore why you write and what inspires and shapes your work. But let's like go back to your community and your childhood. So one of the lines that stood out to me in your book, quote, "Mecca is both a city and the girl up the block." So I actually know a Mecca.
I do too.
who is Muslim, but I also know that 8 times out of 10, Mecca probably isn't Muslim, may live in a community where there are Muslims, or perhaps was born into a community or family where people have a particular connection or respect for, especially Black Muslims and their legacy in America. Or she was born into a family that is really amazing at giving dope names, right? Because naming children, especially the naming of Black children, still remains an important task, right? And this name has to have power. It's often connected to the divine and possibility. And so I'm sort of wondering, who are the people, right? Who are the people? What community? What things shaped you? What people helped you to become who you are?
So it's very interesting that you pointed that out because that specific Mecca, her first name is Mecca, her middle name is Nadira, and she's not Muslim. So those are two very Arabic names and two very Islamic names, like on top of that. It's not just like, her family loved Arabic names. Those are two very Islamic names. So finding that out is always extremely funny to me because I was just like, wow, that's amazing. That's wonderful. And she's also a poet as well. And so, yeah, for me, a lot of what I grew up around was a community of Black Muslims. I am from Maryland, but my family originally is from New Jersey. My grandfather was one of the first Sunni Muslims in his area in New Jersey. It was like at one point, it was just two families that were Sunni Muslim, my family and another family that was like down the street. And this was at a time, where this was the 50s. So this was at a time where like the Nation of Islam was very prevalent and different things like that. And so when a lot of people have like conversations about like how a lot of Black American Muslims came into Islam, right? I have always had it from a very Sunni perspective. My family, yes, shout out to Jersey. My family never came into Islam through any other means, just through Sunni Islam. So I am technically third generation Muslim in my family. And so that was kind of my upbringing and my foundation. A lot of my Islam was through the lens of Black liberation and liberation for all. So that's kind of how my father raised us around as, Islam essentially being um, a means for liberation of all. And I think that that's important, especially within that time, because you have the 60s and the 60s and you're coming like out of the civil rights movement and into, the Black liberation movement. You have the Panthers. I have a really funny story of my dad trying to run away from home and trying to join the Black Panthers, and my father and my grandfather meeting him at the train station and telling him basically, boy, if you don't get your behind in this car, we're gonna have a problem. So it was, it was also seen as a means to unify, as well, unify communities. So that's kind of like my cultural upbringing and my religious upbringing. As I said, I grew up in Maryland, so for the most part, if you're from the DMV area, it's kind of a very cultural, I hate the word melting pot, I will say mixing pot, I guess. Considering there's just so many airports and different things like that, there's a little bit of everyone everywhere. I think DC has the largest population of Ethiopians outside of Ethiopia, just to give you an example. Right. So I grew up around all different types of people. I grew up, had one best friend who was Somali, had another best friend that was Cameroonian, had another best friend that was El Salvadorian, all of that type of stuff. And one of the things that my family really loved was getting able to know people of different cultures, being able to know different cultures, being able to essentially, if they put me in the world, not being able to feel like I was lost, being able to find a place, being able to find a level of home, a level of comfort, no matter where I was, and doing that through creating community through other people. So, yeah, it wasn't until I got to about maybe, goodness. So in kindergarten, I was in Islamic school and there was a lot of anti-Blackness, but I didn't know it, right? So for example, like my kindergarten teacher every morning would redo my hair after my mother did my hair because of the way my braids were, right? And so as a kid, you don't catch that. But when you get older, you're like, oh, that's what that was, right? This Arab Egyptian woman is redoing this little black girl's hair because she doesn't like the way that it is, right? Or confusing me with the only other black girl in class, right? She would always confuse our names. So it was happening, but I wasn't aware of it. And I honestly didn't get aware of it until I became a teenager. And then I started to be able to place a name to what was happening. So then I was it kind of shook me a little bit because I had always had this idea that everyone is embraced for who they are, everyone's culture is embraced, especially under Islam, right? If there's anywhere else where you can be accepted for who you are, it's under Islam and as a Muslim. And so being in my childhood masjid and not being accepted that way was a little off-putting. And so a lot of the poems in Seven that have to deal with the anti-Blackness that I dealt with are really talking about those foundational moments of anti-Blackness where I finally started to understand this is what is happening now. So that's just a little bit about like my upbringing and my way of life and how I kind of, when I speak about it in the book, what it is that I'm talking about.
So what did you take from, so I'm really fascinated with, I think because I've benefited from it, I've been a witness to it intimately, and it's something that I consistently study, and that is like placemaking, and in particular, Black placemaking, right? And in essence, what that means is sort of folks taking very little and making something very beautiful, right? Sort of leaning into the capacity to create what they need, and the reality that they always have that capacity. And so from those sort of like these early communities, as you're saying, like two families, and being a third generation Muslim, what lessons do you take from that, right? Because people really were like sort of starting from nothing and figuring it out along the way. And so, yes, we do have like this persistent issue of anti-Blackness within the Muslim community. And of course, Black Muslims are experiencing it outside of the Muslim community as well, right? But there's also this very beautiful and important element of how we have created space for ourselves again and again, and the wisdom that we can find in that. And so I'm just sort of wondering, like, what are your takeaways from your family's experience?
Some of the main takeaways that I have from my family experience, from my family's experience, is kind of just, for one, I'm always in awe of my grandfather, Rahimullah, may Allah have mercy on his soul. I'm always in awe of him because of how he came into Islam. He essentially was a singer, and yeah, and he came into Islam and it was just like everything is gone, the singing's gone, the this is gone, the that is gone, the lifestyle, we're doing a complete 180. And I'm always in awe of the courage of that. And then I'm also in awe of my grandmother to be able to stay his side and stay on his side and to say, it's very interesting. There's this story that we have in my family. Originally, when my grandfather came to my grandmother with the idea of becoming Muslim, and once again, this is at a time where like Islam is really, unless it's through the NLI, nobody really knows, much about it. And my grandmother goes to like leaves him and goes to stay with my great grandmother, and my great grandmother is like a deaconess in the church, like very strong, like a very strong presence in the church. And she asks her, she goes, is he beating you? And she's like, no. Is he drinking? No. Is he, is he basically harming you or abusing you in any way? And she's like, no. And she's like, you need to go back to him because whatever he's doing is right. Right. And this is coming from a deaconess in the church. So I think one of the very small things that are also extremely major is just how we as Black people hold on to faith. and almost like hold on to it with all hands, all feet, just like wrapped around it, you know. For my great grandmother to say that and to be so deep into the church is very profound, because it just shows how much we care about faith and how much we feel like faith can heal. So I feel like that is probably like the small thing, but at the same time, it's so magnifying as well. And I'm just in awe of my ancestors, of how well they held on to that faith.
Wow, mashallah. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to dive in a little bit into your sort of your poetry, or rather explore your relationship with poetry. So one, how did you discover that poetry was a tool that you wanted to use to communicate with the world? And how has the act of writing poems aided you along your personal journey?
So I am the last of 5 children. So coming from a big family is very intimidating for a lot of people. Coming from a big family and then also being the last. And I was the last between like a huge gap. So me and my eldest sibling is a gap of 13 years. And then the next sibling is 12 years. And then the next sibling is 11. And then my brother, who's like right before me, there's 4 years. So I was growing up at a time where my 3 oldest siblings are in high school. They're getting ready to go to college. My father is a very analytical person, very political person. My father is a retired criminal defense attorney. So my dad is like the type of person that'll put on CNN and make us all watch it and ask our opinions of what's going on in the world at like 10 years old, right? So for me, in many ways, that will writing, because I used to just keep journals and just write. It wasn't anything formal. It wasn't considered poetry. It was literally just journaling. Any thought I had, I put down. And for me, it was kind of like a way to grant myself a voice, a way to grant myself some space, until I got to the point where my father started sitting me down, watching CNN, asking me, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I could start to articulate that. So, but I do, as Ellen said, so graciously in my introduction, I do come from a family of writers. So my father is an author. I think every single one of my siblings at one point or another dabbled into poetry, or spoken word. And not just like, you know, this was a high school assignment, so I wrote, but like actively dabbled into poetry. And so it was interesting enough, in our area we have what's called MIST, so it's called Muslim Interscholastic Tournament, and it's basically where Muslim teenagers in high school age, they come for a tournament. It's a weekend long tournament, and it has the top to bottom of literally every possible competition you can think of. So spoken word, 3D arts, 2D arts, nasheed, singing, I mean, you name it, Quran competition, basketball, it has everything. So the year prior, my brother had actually won first place in poetry. And I was turning 13. 13 is the age where, you know, they allow you to start MIST. And my mom was like, you're going to do poetry and you're going to win because your brother did it and he won. And in my mind, I'm like, where's the correlation? Like, just because he did it, like what? So I was like, okay, I'll try it out. I actually ended up winning third place, so it wasn't too bad for my first time out. And through that, I found other avenues of poetry. So I started to meet people who were doing poetry through different organizations. So I'm not too far from DC. DC has a poetry slam team under the organization of Split This Rock. So through MIST, I was able to meet some people like that. And they were like, oh, you need to come to slams. You need to, you know, we have like a workshop here and there and stuff like that. And so that's really what kind of opened me to poetry. And I was like, oh, like this is something I could do. And then also too, to see people who looked like me who were doing it was amazing. But interestingly enough, HBO had created a documentary called Brave New Voices. This was like way, way back. I can't even tell you what year, but and I remember watching it, and this is before even thinking about poetry. I remember watching it, and it's a huge poetry slam. It's the world's largest international poetry slam. And there were people from all over. And my dad had asked me, I was about 10 years old. My dad had asked me, he was like, do you want to go there? Once again, this is before I even thought about poetry. I was like, yeah, I would love to. Lo and behold, I ended up finding the avenue that would eventually send me, to Brave New Voices. And so one of the things that I really held on to was I didn't get accepted onto the DC team. And it just so happened that I had seen that the Baltimore team had tryouts. Now, at the time, I lived an hour away from Baltimore. And so I'm like calling my mom on the phone. I'm crying and I'm like, can we go to Baltimore tomorrow? And my mom's like, Baltimore? Like, are you kidding me? Because it's so far away. But, mother's love and all that stuff. So she ended up taking me to Baltimore. And through that, I found a whole community. I found mentors. I found wonderful peers. I found people who really, when we talk about like the people who are behind how I could get to this point, like through the people in Baltimore was how I was able to cultivate a lot of my skills with poetry. When we talk about how this book was created, these were the people who really sat down with me and went through the nuts and bolts and the ins and outs. It got a little hectic at some point because artists are sensitive.
They are.
But I do have a wonderful mentor who I trust, but at some points I was like, you're trying me, but through the Baltimore youth poetry team, I was able to find really a whole community that cultivated the voice of the youth through poetry.
So how has that relationship or your relationship with like crafting poems changed from the beginning when you first started writing? Because I think we have sort of this similar experience. When I first started writing poetry as well, it's mainly just sort of like writing thoughts and things in my journal and not really sharing that with anyone except my parents. And I remember my dad always saying, this is amazing. And I remember thinking, he's lying. Like I was really like, there's no way he's telling the truth. And so like gradually getting to that point where I felt comfortable to share that work in person. But I think there's definitely like this sort of experience of where you are when you first start writing. And then sort of growing into your writing and thinking more deeply about not only how people receive your work, but what the work is doing for you. And so what do you feel like this sort of art of crafting poems has done for you or is doing for you at this point?
I think so. As I said before, I kind of came into poetry from a performance level. So I was never really too intimidated by the performance aspect of it. I had also done debate in middle school. So I was kind of used to like the standing up in front of a bunch of people and stating what it is that you have to state, aggressively sometimes and low sometimes, and all that type of stuff. So the performance of it, I wasn't too intimidated by. Plus, also, my family would literally sit us all down and make me perform my poem in front of everyone. And my mom was into theater when she was in high school. So we definitely worked on like enunciation and all that type of stuff. But one thing that was very interesting when I first started to write poems, it was a lot of like extremely strong, like feminist, like I'm going to rule the world, I'm going to save the world, very Powerpuff Girls, right? And I remember a mentor of mine was like, that is very lovely, that's wonderful, you go ahead and save the world, but where's the you in this poem? Where's Sadiyah? And he was like, you're hiding behind all this wonderful, there's war going on here, there's famine going on here. what does it have to do with you? And he basically was like, just because you're Muslim and things are happening to Muslims in Palestine isn't good enough. We need to find a deeper level of connection into your poetry. And that's really what shifted. This is about when I was 16, and that's really what shifted my dynamic of poetry and how I write and how I perform, because then it started to become more introspective. Then it started to become more about me, and less in a narcissistic way, but more in a, I'm going to write about me, and hopefully the people who have gone through it, the people who understand it, the people who see it and see me, appreciate this work.
I'm really glad that your mentor gave you that advice. I think everyone has to go through that process. There's an interview actually where Nikki Giovanni says that sort of writing poems is how she practices the art of being human, right? And so there is a moment where you have to sort of center yourself and center your experience and how you view the world and what you're going through. Like everything isn't about sort of writing about what you see, but also what's happening on the inside. So I want to dive into your collection. So I am first and foremost a lover of quotes, and you start this collection with a quote. So your collection of Poetry 7 begins with a quote by poet Hannah V. Sawyer. Quote, "I pray you raise a daughter with gun for tongue." So I'm wondering, why did you use this quote, and how do you think it helps to prepare or create an intentional path for readers to engage your words?
So Hannah is actually a very dear friend of mine. And so I remember when she was writing that poem and she had that line, and I was just like, you know, sometimes you hear a poem and you're literally like, I wish I could write that. Like, I wish I wrote that line. And that was one of those lines where I was like, I wish I wrote that. And the transparency that it took for that poem to even be conceived and brought out into the world was a thing to behold in and of itself. And so, interestingly enough, my father always used to call me a little militant. He used to call me Erica Huggins, who, for those who may not be familiar, was a member of the Black Panther Party. And yeah, he would always just describe me as someone, and even my mother would be like, don't get Sadia started. You don't want to do that. Not that one. Like, even at a very young age. And so I always felt as though what it is that I had to say was a very powerful tool of mine. And so that quote starting the book is kind of an introduction to how I view myself and how I think of my future.
Okay, so the first few pages of your book for me feels like an intimate introduction into your life. So through your words, I know who whispered in your ear when you were born. I know that you come from a long line of people who say what needs to be said with their chest, to quote you, because the heart speaks the loudest. And so I feel like these poems outline your lineage and your name, right? And you sort of enter that immediately. What inspired you to begin this collection of poetry by defining your name?
So 7 in and of itself has a lot to do with me. And there's a poem in the book, because that was one of the suggestions from my mentor. He was kind of like, maybe you write a poem where people can kind of understand your connection with the number 7 a little bit deeper. So like, I have 7 letters in my name. I'm the 7th person in my family. I was born on the 7th in 97. So like, all of these very major moments in my life kind of all draw to the number 7. And so subsequently 7 is my favorite number. So when writing it, I wanted to start out with who I am, my lineage, my name, etc. Because 7 isn't just a number for me, it encompasses a lot of who I am. It speaks to a lot of what I know. It's a number that has been there with me literally since the beginning. And so I kind of wanted to draw out this introduction of me so that folks can understand that this is just more than just, a number for myself. And then also too, so that, another thing, another suggestion from my mentor. It's so funny because all these suggestions I was like, no, and then ended up doing. But another suggestion, he said was like, this is, originally reading it, he was like, this is really great for people who know you. But if I don't know you, what about this? What about your poems are supposed to make me care about you? What about this is supposed to make me pick this up off of a shelf or give it to a friend, right? So that was kind of, in taking that suggestion, I felt as though I needed to get a little bit more deeper with who I am.
I think you did amazing. I feel like I know your family. I'm pretty sure you're probably related or something. You did an amazing job at crafting that and bringing people into your family, your experience, and how you see yourself, right? And how you see all the sort of like power and the story and the history behind like your name and the family that you were born into. So as Ellen mentioned earlier, you use poetry to, or you have at least in this collection, you're using poetry to examine family, harm, sexism, and anti-Blackness within and outside of the American Muslim community. But there's also an intentional focus on healing, radical self-love, and learning from each moment. I believe that poems are living heirlooms, wisdom that we give and leave behind. And so if we imagine poetry as an intimate heirloom, now that you are a mother, how has motherhood shaped your work? And what wisdom do you want to give to your children through your words?
I think it's kind of what you said. Motherhood has kind of stripped me of the ego of like wanting to be a Maya Angelou someday, or just like, someone who like everyone touts as the greats and stuff like that. It's kind of stripped me of that ego, and now it's kind of been more so a kind of a verbal lineage, especially as Black Americans. We are so stripped of, lineage in so many different ways, be it land, be it knowledge of our ancestors, be it just words, sayings, etc. That I now want to create something that like generations from now, like great grandchildren can say, this is from my great grandmother, and have something to go back to and have something to hold on to, something that's tangible. So that's really what motherhood has done for me, is kind of stripped me of that ego of like wanting to be the greats, and more so just wanting to make something on record that says, hey, I existed and you exist because I exist, and we exist within one another. So yeah.
Wow, thank you for that. So I know that either you've completed or you're currently working on your next collection of poetry that highlights the lived experiences of Black Muslims in America. Can you share more about this work and some of the inspiration behind it? And I guess in what way is it different from this collection 7?
Sure. So it did start, a lot of the poems started from after I became a mother, which kind of shifted how I viewed my own family, how I viewed community, how I viewed the world, because it's very funny, like, all these things happen in your life, and then you become responsible for a small human being, and you're like, oh my God. Like, I remember, my relationship with my mother, as well as just then it kind of like spread into like community, and what is my community like, and how has racism and anti-Blackness affected my community, and what could my community look like if it didn't exist, and all of these questions that I then had. And then it kind of turned into then looking back, that idea of Sankofa, going back to go and get what needs to come forward. And so then looking into slavery, looking into some of like the foundational moments of what it is that brought my family here and brought my family together. And so that's kind of where the book is. How it's different from Seven is that I think it's a lot more intentional. Seven was kind of me, you know, bringing together poems that I had done for so many years and then finding a way to make it flow, as opposed to this book is it has a very intentional focus and a very intentional purpose. So that if people don't know, for example, that some of the first people who celebrated Ramadan in America were Africans who were enslaved, they're going to find out through here. And this is going to be a detailed account of what it looked like through my lens, and, you know, not very Alex Haley-ish, but but through my lens from what it is that I know of my family and stuff like that, and how it is that years from now, my family can become Muslim. So it's a lot more intentional in its focus. It focuses specifically on just like the Black American Muslim family. And in many ways, it looks at my family specifically and just like overall.
I'm excited about this forthcoming collection. So it's interesting that you brought up Maya Angelou. So before we open the space for comments, I actually want to begin my final question with a quote from Maya Angelou. And that quote is, "We need to remember that we are created creative and can invent new scenarios as frequently as they are needed." And so this quote is taken from an interview with Maya Angelou, where she's sort of centering the importance of the human being to remember that they are a creation of God, right? And that they were created with the capacity to consistently build and create what they need at all times, right? That life is going to ebb and flow. And even when the world is on fire, you still have the capacity to create and build what you need in that moment. So one of the lines in your book, "I don't know a language where my body exists," which is a powerful and layered line, which I invite you to unpack if you're comfortable. But what do you, I'm thinking from that line, I feel like when I read that line in your book, I immediately thought of this quote actually from Maya Angelou. And I'm wondering, what do you seek to reclaim with each poem? And what new language do you hope to create with your words? If the language doesn't exist, or at the time of you writing that piece, if you felt that there was no language to help you love your existence and your body and all the things that make you you, what are you doing now? What are you doing with your words? How are you creating that language now? And what does that language look like? And what does it feel like?
They're getting to a point where I now have done what it is that my mentor has asked of me, of putting myself in my poetry, and gotten very comfortable in it. A lot of it is reclaiming myself. A lot of it is reclaiming a young Sadiyah. A lot of it is reclaiming an adolescent Sadiyah, a teenage Sadiyah. A lot of it is saying, hey, Sadiyah, 10 years from now, we're still going to be all right. You know, so a lot of it is kind of just being my own constant reminder of Allah, of faith, of family, of community. And then two, as I said before, creating a certain lineage within my words, creating almost my own little documentary of who I am through my words, so that years from now, generations from now, etc., nobody really has to question who it is that I am, right? So like, for example, I have great grandparents that I've never even met, I've never even heard of, I've never even seen before, I don't even, know the name of until I got older. I'm left-handed. I went most of my life not realizing that the gene came from my grandfather's father. It wasn't until my grandfather was on his deathbed and kind of had like a aha moment to tell us that his father was left-handed, right? And so I feel like that is kind of something that a lot of people amongst the African diaspora can understand and can feel, because of enslavement, because of migration, etc. Is kind of like the looking back and not knowing who we're even looking to. And so I feel like I am kind of trying to create a space with which someone can look back and see a whole person.
So pulling in your mentor's advice, because that was a really beautiful answer. But a lot of that centers other people and like other people looking back. What does this new language do for you?
I think this new language, what it does for me is it reinforces my ability to heal myself. I think honestly, a lot of times I have looked for it externally. As a child, you look for it in your parents. When you get older, you look for it in mates or different things like that, or different activities, whatever. And it's been hard to look for it in myself, look for the ability to heal within myself, to kind of cuddle myself and say, it's okay, it's going to be okay. Here's how we're going to make it okay. And so I feel like my words honestly are kind of a reminder that it's kind of a hug to myself. It's kind of a hug to myself, especially from times where I felt voiceless. This here is my voice. At times where I felt lonely, this here is how I can create space for myself in that loneliness, you know? And so, yeah, I think it's really just kind of like my reminder that I exist, and that's a good thing. And I'm going to continue to existing, inshallah, and I'm going to continue to have to hold myself, heal myself, and be with myself. And that's a wonderful thing.
It is indeed. And I'm looking forward to your words. And I'm really glad that you shared that, because I think especially within the Black Muslim community and within like Black culture at all, I think in general, I think there are particular people that we hold up and that we name often for very good reasons, right? They deserve their name to be, called upon and lifted up. And we should respect their contribution to society at large and to us. But often we don't know like the intimate parts, or we don't really think necessarily about how that person struggled and what they did to mend themselves again and again. And so it's a beautiful gift to be able to leave that legacy, and to show sort of like this element of the imperfect beauty of all of us, and that we all were figuring it out. Because there's definitely this way in which someone could read your work years from now, where it may seem like you knew it all, right? And you had all the answers. But of course, no one has all the answers. And so being intentional about that vulnerability and that process, I think it's a gift to you. It's a gift to folks who read it, and it's definitely a gift to your descendants. So I want to bring in a few questions, if you have some. One of the first questions that I see is, does your new collection have a title yet?
Yes, it's called the Muezzin. So for those who don't know, the Muezzin is basically the person who gives the call to prayer. One of the reasons I named it that is because the first Muezzin is Bilal, who was Black, and he was a companion of the Prophet. And another reason why I named it that is because of just how deeply intimate the call to prayer is, and the reminder and the reminder, the person who reminds. And I wanted this collection to be a way of me reminding people of the experience of Black Americans.
So are you done with this manuscript, or are you still in the process of writing?
We're still in the process of writing. We're in the very, beginning process of writing. It's the beginning, but it's not the beginning. I think for anybody who's written something, you like write for an entire year, and you're like, I'm still at the beginning. So this is going on like almost 2 years now. That I've been writing it, and I still technically feel as though I'm in the beginning.
I understand that. Sure. I don't see any comments thus far. So what's your writing process like? And I guess obviously, alhamdulillah, you just had a new baby. How is motherhood also sort of impacting how creative you have to be to create time to write?
So I remember I read something that said you should read 90% of the time and write 10%. So a lot of it has to do with reading. And then also and just reading anything, an article, it doesn't have to necessarily be poetry itself, but just reading anything, article, novel, etc. And so my writing process honestly is very scattered depending on my relationship with the poem. So like, for example, now I'm trying to write a poem and I'm like, I have to interview someone like who's like one-on-one gone through this experience in order for me to get this poem right. And so sometimes it looks like interviewing folks, sometimes it looks like having a conversation with someone, sometimes it looks like I'm in the middle of the grocery store and a line pops in my head and I have to write it down on my phone. So it really depends on my relationship with the poem itself. And yeah, my writing process is different every time. It's a different relationship every time.
So another question is, what keeps you motivated to write?
I think one of the things that keeps me motivated is the thing that also keeps me scared to write at the same time. I feel like any writer has this like overarching fear that it's like, is this poem the last poem I'll ever write? Are these words the last words that I'll ever say? What does it look like if I get to a point where I'm just done with this? So I think what motivates me is also what scares me, because I'm motivated to write because I kind of want to get to that finish line, but I'm also afraid to get to that finish line.
So how has the theme or the focus of your writing changed or sort of transitioned? So the question is sort of like, what were the themes and focus? And I think you talked about this a little bit, before motherhood versus now. Now that you are a mother, how's that shifted?
I think before motherhood, so essentially 7, right? All the poems that are in that book, I think is before it's kind of, this was an introduction to me starting to be vulnerable and transparent about myself. And now I'm a lot more comfortable in my transparency. And so now my poems are a lot more just sitting in my transparency, and in fact, pushing the button and seeing how far I can go, how far I can be comfortable with being transparent, being open, and talking about things that, otherwise I feel like wouldn't get out there about myself. And just trying to be as truthful as possible, trying to be as authentic as possible. So before it was kind of just testing that water, and now it's kind of just swimming in it.
So I'm not sure how consistently you are like performing your work at this point or over the past couple of years. And I think anyone who is a writer or who's a performer or both knows that there's a distinct difference in many ways from what that poem looks like on the page versus performing that work. And so connected to this sort of idea of you being in this space of feeling like you're pushing the boundaries intentionally, of wanting to be more vulnerable, have you performed some of these poems, or like have you thought about what the experience would be to actually like say these things on a stage in front of people? Because folks reading your vulnerability and you stating that is completely different.
You know, I'm not afraid of the public. I'm afraid of my family. I think one of the things also about, you know, being Black is that sometimes you have this kind of like, what happens in the family stays in the family.
Yeah.
We don't talk about that. You know, we don't say these certain things, etc. And so I'm not afraid of the public hearing it. Sometimes I'm afraid of my family hearing it. And so that's really the thing. I have always asked, like, I really want some poets to come up with a workshop on like, how do you write certain poems when certain family members are still alive? Because I think that's probably like the most nerve-wracking, is to have that like conversation afterwards. Like, what did you mean about that, by that? And stuff. And so yeah, it's never really been about like being afraid of the public. It's more so being afraid of my family. And I feel like some of these poems I have shared, some of them will just be on hold until the book comes out. So yeah, I will keep you all updated about how that goes.
But I think that's also part of that process of even pushing the boundaries, like in our intimate relationships, because you may be ready to write about a thing that you aren't actually ready to talk about, right? And so there's that weird complexity there. So there is like how is my family going to respond to this? And like, if we need to have a conversation, am I ready to have that
Yeah.
conversation? So Ellen is asking, what are you reading and who are your inspirations, or what writers do you love?
My favorite poet of all time is Lucille Clifton.
Yes.
Favorite poet of all time. She never missed an assignment. She was always that's my favorite poet of all time. Currently, things that I'm reading, because it's before Ramadan, I was reading Black Girl Call Home by Jasmine Mans. It's a collection of poetry by Jasmine Mans. And since it's Ramadan, I've kind of shifted my focus. I'm currently reading Secrets of Divine Love by A. Helwa. And that's kind of about cultivating a relationship of love with the Almighty. So those are kind of the things that I'm reading now that I really, really enjoy.
I'm actually reading both of those books, strangely.
Oh, wow.
Yes, Lucille Clifton is one of my favorite poets as well. And I'm not sure how much you know about her life, but it's worth like researching her experience around writing and being a mother. Like, a lot of her poems are intentionally short. And the reason that they're short is because she had a lot of kids, right? And so she was sort of writing in between her children napping or waking up really early, and sort of using that small slice of time to write. So it's like, I love her work, but I think, as I said earlier, sort of thinking more deeply or investigating like, who is the person behind this poem, learning more about how she mothered and how she sort of included mothering in her writing, like she didn't shy away from that, but the creative ways in which she found time to write. And just a decision to say, I could write a 2-page poem, or it could be 5 sentences because I have kids, right? And to make that decision so that she could still get it done and she could still do what she needed to do with her words and with her creativity.
One of my favorite thing about Lucille Clifton is that Toni Morrison is also one of my tops when it comes to writing. And Toni Morrison actually was editing one of Lucille Clifton's books. And she said, this is in Toni Morrison's documentary, that she gave her the manuscript back. Toni Morrison gave Lucille the manuscript back with all these edits, and she didn't accept a single one. And that's one of my favorite things about Lucille Clifton, just the ability to stand firm as a writer and to say, this is how this is how it is. Like, just because you're my editor, I don't know what, that's very nice that you did all these edits, but let me explain something to you. This is how it is. And the book was still published. So that's just one of my favorite things about Lucille Clifton, and just be like, you know, being a mother, standing firm. Because when you say that too, you also think about, like, did she have the time to go through all those edits and actually edit the manuscript, you know?
First of all, just her telling Toni Morrison no is hilarious.
I love it.
So I know that you'll be sharing your work later this evening. And so I'm wondering if you can close us out with a poem.
Sure, I can close this out with a poem. Let's see. Okay, I will actually close this out with a relatively short poem, which is in the book. It's called Bashir, which is my last name. My last name means the giver of good news. When my father said, I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is his messenger, we were both born, yet still a memory in God's mind. In my first breath, I was a poet. I come from a line of saying it with chest because the heart speaks the loudest. My grandfather is gone. Now, all I have is my truth and my grandfather's memory. And in this, we are both alive.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. I think a link has been shared for folks to join Sadia this evening to hear more of her poetry. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening. I have enjoyed this conversation. Inshallah, we will have many more. And thank you for writing, and thank you for being vulnerable and intentional with your words and your vulnerability. And I'm looking forward to reading your next book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Beautiful conversation.